The crimson sun hung low over the Pacific horizon on June 3, 1942, casting blood-red shadows across the churning waters where destinies would soon collide. Admiral Chuichi Nagumo stood on the bridge of the aircraft carrier Akagi, his weathered hands gripping the rail. As he gazed toward the distant American outpost of Midway Atoll, the same hands that had orchestrated the devastating surprise attack on Pearl Harbor 6 months earlier now trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the weight of what was to come. The Japanese combined fleet stretched across the Pacific like a steel serpent, its backbone formed by 4 of the Imperial Navy's most formidable aircraft carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Hiryu, and Soryu. These floating fortresses had been the instruments of Japan's lightning conquest across the Pacific, their dive bombers and torpedo planes carving an empire from the coral atolls and tropical islands that dotted the world's largest ocean. Behind them sailed Admiral Yamamoto Isaraku's main battle fleet, including the massive battleship Yamato, whose 18-inch guns could reduce any enemy vessel to scrap metal and smoke. According to naval intelligence reports from the Imperial Japanese Navy archives, Operation Me was conceived as the decisive blow that would force America to sue for peace. Midway, a tiny speck of sand and coral 1,500 miles northwest of Hawaii, was more than just another target. It was the key to controlling the Central Pacific. If the Japanese could seize the atoll and destroy the remaining American carrier forces, the path to Hawaii would lie open, and with it, the possibility of bringing the war to America's doorstep. Nagumo's force had already proven its devastating effectiveness. In 6 months of warfare, his carriers had struck targets from Pearl Harbor to Ceylon, sinking battleships, carriers, and cruisers with impunity. His pilots were the finest in the world, veterans of countless battles who could thread a dive bomber through anti-aircraft fire and place a bomb with surgical precision. The Zero fighters that protected them were superior to anything the Americans could field, faster and more maneuverable than the clunky Grumman Wildcats that opposed them. But as the Admiral watched the sun sink toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, a nagging doubt crept into his thoughts. The Americans had shown a disturbing tendency to appear where they were least expected, and their codebreakers had proven surprisingly effective at intercepting Japanese communications. Still, intelligence assured him that the American Pacific Fleet was scattered and weakened, with only 2 or possibly 3 carriers available to oppose his mighty force. The plan was elegant in its simplicity. A diversionary attack on the Aleutian Islands would draw American attention northward while the main force struck Midway. The atoll's defenses would be crushed, the island occupied, and when the inevitable American counterattack came, Nagumo's carriers would be waiting to deliver the killing blow to what remained of the Pacific Fleet. It was a strategy that had worked flawlessly from the South China Sea to the Indian Ocean. As night fell across the Pacific, the Japanese fleet pressed eastward through waters that seemed to stretch endlessly. In all directions, in the ready rooms of the carriers, pilots studied their charts and checked their equipment, confident in their superiority and eager for another victory. None suspected that far to the north, American codebreakers had already unraveled the secrets of Operation Me, and that even now, 3 American carriers were racing through the darkness to spring a trap of their own. Lieutenant Commander Joseph Rockford hunched over his desk in the basement of the 14th Naval District Headquarters in Pearl Harbor, his eyes burning from hours of staring at intercepted Japanese radio transmissions. Coffee cups and overflowing ashtrays cluttered the workspace around him, testament to the sleepless nights he and his team had spent breaking the enemy's naval code. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting harsh shadows across sheets of paper covered with numbers, letters, and cryptographic notations that would have looked like gibberish to anyone outside the world of naval intelligence. For months, Rochford's Combat Intelligence Office had been chipping away at the Japanese Navy's operational code, designated JN-25 by American intelligence. It was painstaking work, requiring intuition as much as mathematics, but gradually the secrets of the Imperial Japanese Navy were being laid bare. By late May of 1942, they had achieved a breakthrough that would change the course of the war in the Pacific. The intercepts painted a clear picture of Japanese intentions. A massive operation, codenamed Me, was being planned for early June. The target appeared to be an American base designated AF in Japanese communications. Rockford was convinced that AF meant Midway, but skeptics in Washington argued it could be Hawaii, the West Coast, or even the Panama Canal. To settle the debate, Rockford devised a brilliant deception. He arranged for Midway to transmit an uncoded message. REPO or TING that the island's water distillation plant had broken down and requesting emergency supplies. Within hours, Japanese radio intercepts reported the AF was experiencing water supply problems. The trap had worked perfectly. Midway was indeed the target of the coming offensive. According to declassified files from the National Security Agency, this single piece of intelligence would prove more valuable than entire fleets of warships. Admiral Chester Nimitz, the soft-spoken but steel-willed commander of the Pacific Fleet, absorbed Rochefort's intelligence with characteristic calm. The Japanese were coming with everything they had, for aircraft carriers to battleships, cruisers, destroyers, submarines, and transport ships carrying invasion troops. Against this armada, Nimitz could field only 3 carriers, the Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown. The latter barely passed together after suffering heavy damage at the Battle of the Coral Sea. Just 1 month earlier, the odds seemed impossibly long, but Nimitz understood that surprise was the great equalizer. While the Japanese expected to face scattered and unprepared American forces, he would position his carriers northeast of Midway, ready to strike at the moment when the enemy was most vulnerable. The plan required perfect timing and no small amount of luck, but it offered the only realistic chance of victory. As the last days of May slipped away, Pearl Harbor became a hive of activity. The damaged Yorktown limped into dry dock, where hundreds of workers swarmed over her hull, welding plates, repairing machinery, and restocking her magazines. What should have taken months was accomplished in 72 hours through sheer determination and round-the-clock labor. Meanwhile, Admiral Raymond Spruance prepared to take the Enterprise and Hornet to sea, their flight decks crowded with dauntless dive bombers and devastator torpedo planes that would soon face the ultimate test of aerial combat. The Japanese were coming with the confidence of conquerors, their admirals and pilots flushed with 6 months of unbroken victory. But they were sailing into a trap laid by codebreakers and intelligence analysts working in basement offices thousands of miles from the front lines. The information war, fought with pencils and calculating machines rather than guns and torpedoes, had already given the Americans their first crucial advantage in what would become the most decisive naval battle of the Pacific War. The pre-dawn darkness of June 4, 1942, was shattered by the thunder of aircraft engines as the first wave of Japanese bombers lifted off. From the flight decks of Nagumo's carriers, Lieutenant Joichi Tominaga led 108 aircraft toward Midway Atoll, their navigation lights winking like deadly fireflies in the black Pacific sky. Below them, the four carriers of the Kido Butai turned into the wind, their deck crews already preparing the second wave of aircraft that would deliver the knockout blow to any American ships foolish enough to challenge the Imperial Navy's supremacy. Aboard the Akagi, Admiral Nagumo felt the familiar satisfaction of a perfectly executed operation. His strike force had approached Midway undetected, positioning themselves to 140 miles northwest of the atoll at precisely the optimal range for their aircraft. The Americans, if they were present at all, would be caught completely off guard. Intelligence reports indicated only a handful of obsolete fighters and bombers on Midway itself, hardly enough to trouble his veteran air crews. But even as Tominaga's bombers approached their target, the trap was already closing. 220 miles northeast of Midway, Rear Admiral Raymond Spruance stood on the flag bridge of the carrier Enterprise, studying intelligence reports that painted a very different picture of the coming battle. Thanks to the codebreakers' work, he knew exactly where the Japanese carriers were positioned, and more importantly, he knew they had launched their first strike against Midway, leaving their flight decks temporarily vulnerable to counterattack. The attack on Midway began at 6:24 in the morning, as Tominaga's bombers screamed down through heavy anti-aircraft fire to pound the atoll's installations. Marine fighters rose to meet them, obsolete Brewster Buffaloes and a handful of newer Wildcats that were hopelessly outnumbered by the escorting Zeros. The sky above Midway became a deadly ballet of twisting aircraft, tracer bullets, and exploding shells as American defenders fought desperately to protect their tiny outpost. Lieutenant George Gay, piloting one of the Marine Wildcats, found himself alone against a formation of Japanese bombers, his wingman already shot down and his own aircraft riddled with bullet holes. He pressed his attack anyway, diving through a hail of defensive fire to rake a Cape torpedo bomber with his machine guns. The Japanese plane exploded in a ball of orange flame, but Gay's moment of triumph was short-lived as a Zero fighter pounced on his damaged Wildcat, sending it spinning toward the lagoon below. On Midway itself, the bombing was devastating but not decisive. Fuel tanks erupted in towering pillars of black smoke, the power plant was destroyed, and several aircraft were reduced to twisted wreckage on their airstrips. But the runways remain operational, and more crucially, the island's radar station continued to function, providing early warning of incoming aircraft that would prove invaluable in the hours to come. As Tomonaga's bombers turned back toward their carriers, the lieutenant commander made a fateful radio transmission to Admiral Nagumo. There's need for a second attack. The message would prove to be one of the most consequential communications in naval history, for it convinced Nagumo that Midway's defenses were stronger than expected, and that another strike would be necessary to neutralize the base before attempting a landing. Unknown to the Japanese admiral, his decision to prepare for a second attack on Midway would leave his carriers desperately vulnerable at the precise moment. When American dive bombers appeared in the sky above them, the codebreakers had given Admiral Spruance the gift of perfect timing, and he was about to use it to devastating effect. At 9:25 that morning, as Japanese deck crews frantically rearmed and refueled their aircraft for the second Midway strike, lookouts aboard the carrier Akagi spotted formations of American bombers approaching from the north-east. The trap had been sprung, and the fate of the Pacific War now hung in the balance above the windswept waters, between the tiny specks of coral and steel in the world's largest ocean. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey gripped the controls of his Douglas Dauntless dive bomber as he searched the empty Pacific below for any sign of the Japanese fleet. His fuel gauge showed dangerously low levels, and behind him, 32 other dive bombers from the Enterprise were running equally short on aviation gasoline. They had been flying for over 2 hours, following the compass bearing that intelligence had provided, but the ocean stretched endlessly in all directions without revealing any trace of enemy ships. At 10:22 in the morning, McCluskey made the decision that would determine the outcome of the Battle of Midway. Instead of turning back to sea fuel, he decided to continue the search pattern, extending his flight path toward the northwest. His pilots followed without question, even though many of them knew they might not have enough fuel to return to their carrier. It was a gamble with their lives, but the stakes were nothing less than control of the Pacific Ocean. The decision proved inspired. At 10:25, McCluskey spotted a lone Japanese destroyer racing northward at high speed, throwing up a distinctive white wake that stood out against the deep blue of the Pacific. The ship was the destroyer Arashi, which had been hunting an American submarine and was now hurrying to rejoin the main fleet. McCluskey followed the destroyer's course, and within minutes, the sight that greeted him was beyond his wildest dreams. Spread out below like toys on a blue carpet were 4 of the Imperial Japanese Navy's most powerful aircraft carriers, their flight decks crowded with aircraft being rearmed and refueled for the second strike against Midway. The carriers Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu were positioned close together, presenting perfect targets for dive bombing attack. Their combat air patrol of Zero fighters was flying low, having just finished dealing with American torpedo bomber attacks that had been pressed home with suicidal courage but little tactical success. Aboard the Akagi, Admiral Nagumo was facing the most difficult decision of his naval career. His flight decks were cluttered with aircraft in various states of preparation, some armed with bombs for the second Midway strike, others hastily being converted to anti-ship configuration as reports filtered in of American carrier forces in the area. Fuel lines snaked across the deck, ammunition was stacked in the open, and his most experienced pilots were either in the air over Midway or waiting in ready rooms for orders. According to accounts preserved in the Japanese Defense Agency's official war history, the admiral's dilemma was further complicated by conflicting intelligence reports about American naval strength in the area. Some sources reported only 2 carriers, others suggested 3, and the exact composition of the enemy force remained frustratingly unclear. What was certain was that his own force was caught in the most vulnerable possible position, with aircraft on deck, fuel lines exposed, and his fighters scattered at low altitude. McCluskey's voice crackled over the radio as he gave the order that would change history: attack. Attack. The Enterprise dive bombers rolled into their steep attack dives, plummeting toward the Japanese carriers at speeds approaching 400 miles per hour. Behind them, bombers from the Yorktown followed suit, their pilots pushing their aircraft to the very limits of structural integrity as they dove through increasingly heavy anti-aircraft fire. The first bomb struck the Akagi amidships, penetrating the flight deck and exploding among aircraft loaded with fuel and ammunition. The blast was catastrophic, sending a geyser of flame and debris high into the air and triggering secondary explosions that raced through the carrier's hangar deck. Within moments, the pride of the Japanese fleet was transformed into a floating inferno. Her flight deck buckled and twisted, her aircraft reduced to burning wreckage. Simultaneously, Other American dive bombers were scoring direct hits on the carriers Kaga and Soryu. Each bomb that found its target triggered massive explosions as aviation fuel ignited and ammunition cooked off in the intense heat. The three carriers that had helped launch the Pearl Harbor attack were now blazing wrecks, their crews fighting desperately to contain fires that threatened to consume the ships entirely. The attack lasted only 6 minutes, but those 6 minutes sealed the fate of the Japanese Empire. In the span of time it takes to brew a cup of coffee, the Imperial Navy lost 3 of its most experienced carriers, along with hundreds of irreplaceable pilots and crew members. The sword of Japanese naval aviation, forged in the surprise attack on Pearl Harbor and sharpened in 6 months of conquest, had finally met a shield it could not penetrate. Captain Tomio Kaku stood on the bridge of the burning aircraft carrier Hiryu, the last operational carrier in Admiral Nagumo's once mighty strike force. As he watched his sister ships transform into floating pyres across the Pacific horizon, the Akagi, his former flagship, listed heavily to starboard, her flight deck a twisted mass of steel wreckage surrounded by pools of burning aviation fuel. The Kaga wallowed dead in the water, thick black smoke pouring from her shattered superstructure, while the Soryu had already begun her final plunge toward the ocean floor. But Hiryu still had teeth, and Captain Kaku was determined to use them. Within an hour of the devastating American dive bomber attack, he had launched every serviceable aircraft remaining on his ship, 18 dive bombers and 6 fighters, led by Lieutenant Michio Kobayashi, one of Japan's most skilled naval aviators. Their target was the American carrier Yorktown, which Japanese reconnaissance had identified as the command ship of the enemy force. The counter-strike found its target at 12:10 in the afternoon. Kobayashi's bombers threw heavy anti-aircraft fire from the Yorktown and her screening destroyers, their pilots displaying the same precision and courage that had made Japanese naval aviation feared throughout the Pacific. 3 bombs struck the American carrier, one penetrating deep into her hull below the waterline, another exploding on the flight deck, and a third starting fires in the forward part of the ship. For a moment, it seemed as though the Hiryu might single-handedly salvage something from the disaster. The Yorktown began listing to port as damage control teams fought to contain flooding and extinguish fires. Her flight operations ceased, and several of her escorting destroyers moved alongside to assist with firefighting efforts. But the respite was temporary, and the Americans' industrial advantage was about to make itself felt in the most decisive way possible. Even as the Yorktown's crew battled to save their ship, dive bombers from the Enterprise and Hornet were preparing for a second strike against the Japanese fleet. Lieutenant Clarence Dickinson, a veteran pilot who had participated in the morning's devastating attack, climbed back into his dauntless bomber with grim determination. His target was the Hiryu, the last Japanese carrier still capable of launching aircraft, and he knew that eliminating her would complete the destruction of Japan's premier naval striking force. According to post-war interviews preserved in the Naval Historical Center archives, the second American attack wave found the Hiryu desperately maneuvering to avoid the fate of her sister ships. Captain Kaku threw his vessel into a series of sharp turns, hoping to present a difficult target for the incoming dive bombers, while his anti-aircraft guns filled the sky with explosive shells and tracer bullets. For a few precious minutes, it seemed as though the carrier might escape destruction. The illusion ended at 5 o'clock in the afternoon when 4 bombs struck the Hiryu in rapid succession. The first penetrated her flight deck near the forward elevator, triggering a massive explosion among aircraft parked in the hangar below. The second and third bombs struck amidships, rupturing fuel lines and starting fires that quickly spread throughout the ship's interior spaces. The fourth bomb, delivered by Dickinson himself, exploded near the carrier's island superstructure, destroying her primary communications equipment and bridge. Within an hour, the Hiryu was a blazing wreck. Her flight deck split open like a broken egg and her hangar spaces filled with toxic smoke and raging fires. Captain Kaku ordered his remaining crew to abandon ship, though he himself chose to go down with his vessel in accordance with the ancient traditions of the Imperial Navy. As darkness fell across the Pacific, the pride of Japanese naval aviation slipped beneath the waves, taking with her the dreams of empire that had driven Japan to war. The human cost of the disaster was staggering. In addition to the 4 irreplaceable aircraft carriers, the Japanese had lost over 300 trained pilots and crew members, men who represented years of training and combat experience that could never be recovered. These were not raw recruits or hastily trained replacements, but the cream of Japanese naval aviation veterans who had participated in campaigns from Pearl Harbor to the Indian Ocean. Even more devastating than the immediate losses was the psychological impact of the defeat. For 6 months, the Japanese military had seemed invincible, sweeping across the Pacific in an unstoppable tide of conquest. Midway shattered that illusion forever, demonstrating that American industrial power and tactical innovation can overcome even the most skilled and experienced enemy forces when properly applied. Admiral Yamamoto Isoroku stood in the flag plot of the super battleship Yamato, staring at the tactical display that showed the locations of his scattered fleet across hundreds of miles of Pacific Ocean. Red symbols marked the positions where 4 of Japan's finest aircraft carriers had met their doom, while blue symbols indicated the approximate locations of American task forces that had seemingly appeared from nowhere to deliver this crushing blow to Japanese naval power. The architect of Pearl Harbor felt the weight of strategic failure settling on his shoulders. Like a burial shroud, Operation Me, conceived as the decisive stroke that would force America to negotiate for peace, had instead become the greatest naval disaster in Japanese history. Not since the Mongol invasion fleets of the 13th century had Japan suffered such a catastrophic defeat at sea, and unlike those ancient disasters, this one could not be blamed on divine intervention or natural typhoons. Throughout the night of June 4th to 5th, 1942, damage reports continued to flow into Yamato's radio room, each transmission adding to the mounting tally of destruction. The carrier Akagi, Admiral Nagumo's flagship, had been abandoned and scuttled by Japanese destroyers after her fires proved impossible to control. The Kaga had suffered a similar fate, her magazines finally exploding in a blast that illuminated the night sky for miles around. The Soryu had already disappeared beneath the waves, taking most of her crew with her, while the Hiryu limped northward as a blazing wreck, before finally sinking in the early hours of June 5th. The human toll was even more devastating than the material losses. Captain Jisaku Okada of the Kaga, Commander Ryusaku Yanagimoto of the Soryu, and Captain Tomio Kaku of the Hiryu had all chosen to go down with their ships, following the naval tradition of taking responsibility for their vessel's fate. With them died hundreds of irreplaceable pilots, mechanics, and crew members who had formed the backbone of Japanese carrier aviation. According to classified documents from the Japanese Naval General Staff, preserved in post-war archives, Yamamoto seriously considered pressing forward with the operation despite the carrier losses. His battleship force remained intact, including the massive Yamato with her 18-inch guns, and the invasion transports were still approaching Midway from the west. A night surface action might yet salvage something from the disaster, but intelligence reports suggested that American land-based bombers were already being reinforced on Midway, making any daylight approach by his remaining ships tantamount to suicide. The bitter reality was that without air cover from his carriers, Yamamoto's surface ships were helpless against American air attacks. The age of the battleship was ending, replaced by a new era of naval warfare in which aircraft carriers would dominate the world's oceans. The Japanese had pioneered many of these new tactics, but at Midway they had learned that their enemies could adapt and improve upon their innovations with devastating effect. At 5:05 in the morning on June 5th, Yamamoto issued the order that effectively ended Japan's dream of Pacific conquest. Operation Me is canceled. All forces will withdraw to the northwest. The invasion fleet turned away from Midway, carrying with it the troops and equipment that had been intended to extend Japanese control deeper into the Central Pacific, instead of advancing toward Hawaii and the American West Coast. The Empire was now forced into its first strategic retreat of the Pacific War. The withdrawal was not without further cost. The heavy cruiser Mikuma, damaged in a collision during the chaotic night retirement, fell victim to American dive bombers the following day. Her sister ship, the Mogami, limped back to Japan with severe damage, her superstructure twisted into scrap metal by bomb hits and near misses. Even in defeat, the Pacific Ocean demanded its tribute of steel and blood from those who dared to challenge its vastness. As the remnants of the combined fleet struggled back toward their home bases, Yamamoto found himself contemplating the strategic implications of the disaster. Japan had begun the war with 10 aircraft carriers of various sizes, and had already lost 6 of them in the first 8 months of fighting. American industrial capacity was producing new carriers at a rate that would soon overwhelm any Japanese construction program, while the loss of experienced pilots at Midway would take years to replace. The Empire had suffered a wound that would indeed never fully heal. From this point forward, Japan would be fighting a defensive war, trading space for time, while American forces grew stronger with each passing month. The initiative had passed forever to the United States, and with it, any realistic hope of achieving the negotiated peace that had been the ultimate goal of Japanese strategy since the attack on Pearl Harbor. 6 months after the disaster at Midway, Admiral Nagumo Chuichi sat in his quarters aboard the light cruiser Sendai, anchored in the supposedly safe harbor of Truk Lagoon in the Caroline Islands. His new command was a pale shadow of the mighty Kido Butai that had once terrorized the Pacific, a handful of destroyers and cruisers tasked with training replacement pilots for carriers that no longer existed. The irony was not lost on him that he, who had commanded the most powerful naval striking force in history, was now reduced to shepherding novice aviators in aircraft that were increasingly obsolete. The reports spread across his desk told the story of an empire in retreat. American forces had landed on Guadalcanal in August, beginning a bloody campaign that was slowly grinding down Japan's remaining naval aviation strength. The great air base at Rabaul, once considered impregnable, was under constant attack from American bombers flying from newly constructed airfields. Most ominously, intelligence reports spoke of American carriers appearing in greater numbers than ever before, not just the repaired veterans of Midway, but brand new ships rolling off American assembly lines at a pace that defied comprehension. Lieutenant Commander Joseph Rockford, the codebreaker whose intelligence had made the Midway victory possible, had been quietly transferred to other duties. His warnings about Japanese intentions no longer needed as American forces seized the strategic initiative across the Pacific, but his legacy lived on in the continued breaking of Japanese naval codes, which now provided American commanders with a detailed picture of their enemy's declining capabilities and increasingly desperate strategic situation. The ripple effects of Midway were being felt far beyond the Pacific theater. In Europe, Nazi Germany had been forced to abandon any hope of Japanese assistance in challenging Allied control of the Indian Ocean, while the Soviet Union could transfer additional forces from Siberia to the critical battles around Stalingrad. The global balance of power had shifted decisively in favor of the Allies, and Japan found itself increasingly isolated as its European partners faced their own mounting crises. According to post-war analyses by the United States Strategic Bombing Survey, the Battle of Midway marked the beginning of Japan's terminal decline as a naval power. The empire would continue to fight with desperate courage for nearly 3 more years, but it would never again possess the strength to threaten Allied control of the Pacific sea lanes. Each subsequent battle would see Japanese forces outnumbered by larger margins, equipped with increasingly inferior weapons, and manned by pilots with less and less training and experience. The human dimension of the disaster continued to unfold in training bases, at flight schools across Japan, where instructors struggled to replace the irreplaceable. The pilots lost at Midway had represented not just individual skill, but institutional knowledge built up over years of combat experience. Their successors, hastily trained and thrown into battle with minimal preparation, would face American aviators flying superior aircraft and backed by an industrial machine that could replace losses faster than they could be inflicted. Admiral Yamamoto, architect of the Pearl Harbor attack and commander of the combined fleet, would not live to see the ultimate consequences of the Midway defeat. His death in April 1943, when American P-38 fighters shot down his transport aircraft over the Solomon Islands, was itself made possible by code-breaking intelligence, similar to that which had doomed his carriers at Midway. The man who had warned his government that Japan could run wild for only 6 months to a year in a war with America had been proven tragically correct. By the war's end in August 1945, the Imperial Japanese Navy had ceased to exist as an effective fighting force. Its remaining ships lay at the bottom of harbors from Yokosuka to Kure, victims of American carrier raids and bombing attacks that the depleted Japanese Air Force was powerless to prevent. The empire that had once stretched from the Aleutian Islands to the borders of Australia had been reduced to the formerly Japanese islands, their cities in ruins and their people facing starvation. The Battle of Midway had indeed inflicted a wound on the Japanese Empire that would never fully close, but more than that, it had demonstrated the decisive importance of intelligence, industrial capacity, and tactical flexibility in modern warfare. The codebreakers working in basement offices had proven as crucial as the pilots diving through anti-aircraft fire, while American factories had shown that wars were won not just on battlefields, but in the workshops and assembly lines where the tools of victory were forged. In the end, the 6 minutes of dive bombing that destroyed Japan's carrier striking force at Midway had determined not just the outcome of a single battle, but the fate of empires and the shape of the post-war world. The thunder of those diving dauntless bombers would echo through history, A reminder that even the mightiest military forces could be brought low by superior intelligence, better planning, and the courage of ordinary men facing extraordinary circumstances in the vast blue expanse of the Pacific Ocean.